have a motion or discussion on these minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Got a motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second. Mine didn't. Okay, let's see what happens.
Okay, I've got a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed?
I'd like to abstain.
Okay, so we've got, so the motion will carry 6-0 with one abstaining. Thank you. And moving on to public comment for issues that are not on tonight's agenda. Christina, do we have any public comment online? Seeing none, we will move on to tonight's work session, which is the third work session on climate-friendly and equitable communities. And the Planning Commission will conduct its third work session regarding rules for parking reform, which will include an overview of a revised project schedule and public engagement plan, as well as a high-level analysis of the pros and cons of the different options available to the city for compliance. We've got Erik Olson, who will give us an update.
Thank you, Chair Stewart, and good evening, Commissioners. That's right, we're here to talk again about the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules for parking reform specifically. I'm hoping to start calling this citywide parking reform as opposed to climate-friendly and equitable communities. It's just less of a mouth load. So anyway, less of a mouthful, and it's easier to just, it's about parking. So anyway, hoping to slowly transition away, but want people to still understand that this is about CFEC and our response to those rules. Really today, I'm going to provide as quick as possible, really of a background and overview of what we've heard so far about these rules. I'm going to try to do a high-level overview as kind of requested from the planning commissioners of the different options to comply with the CFEC rules. And then I'm going to finish by talking through a revised schedule and public engagement plan that I put together per direction from council. All right, so just to start with an overview, this is kind of a review of what we've covered at recent meetings and what's been presented to us from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD. This is again review, but as you're aware, we've already implemented Phase A of the parking related requirements for CFEC, which means that there are no parking requirements within the area that you see on that map there. All the yellow area means that there's no parking currently required, or at least we're not enforcing the current parking requirements in that area. And that's to meet the state rules for CFEC Phase A. The other thing that we've done to comply is amend our, or really apply, again, the direct state rule, but apply that directly for electric vehicle charging conduits. 40% of new spaces must have conduits serving them in new developments. And just to talk about what we have to do in the next year or so, we're going to be tasked with updating our transportation systems plan. I'll be talking to you more about that sometime soon. But right now we're talking about the Phase B parking requirements, which we are required to adopt by the end of the year next year through an extension that we were granted by DLCD. So just an overview of kind of what we heard from DLCD on what the rationale for these rules are and what the sort of rationale is for just generally reducing parking mandates. I think the biggest point here is that it's a market-based approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that no parking will be provided, but it's going to be something that would be more responsive to supply and demand. So we have some examples where less parking was required than was actually constructed, even when folks went through and eliminated or reduced the parking requirements in places like Eugene and Corvallis. Another good reason for these mandates is that parking uses a lot of land. So really you can see, as we've discussed, a lot of cities really have a parking management problem more than they have a parking supply shortage. So the issue isn't necessarily that we're not using or that we don't have parking, it's that it's not necessarily available or accessible or used as efficiently as it could be. Another really big point to make here is that parking is extremely expensive, and the money that you use for to construct parking displaces housing, makes it so you can't construct housing. So we talked about some, few different examples of that sort of illustrate this, but essentially it shows some of these studies 10 to 20% of total housing cost, 17% of rent. Essentially, the more parking that's required, the fewer affordable housing units are constructed on a particular development. So just a review there. And of course, just a lot of the parking that we do have is not utilized. So looking in different areas of the country, similar to ours and some not so similar to ours, you can see that the sort of vacancy rates for parking on average range between 25 and 40%. So we're using a lot of land that could be used for housing on parking, and it's not necessarily being utilized, even the parking that has been built. I was also tasked by the Planning Commission to look into kind of the original legislative intent of parking requirements and the rationale for them. Essentially, it looks like, as with many other cities, the city established their parking requirements based on what other cities were doing, which was consulting the Institute of Transportation Engineers handbooks back in 1961, and the calculations that they had at that time, which were fairly arbitrarily selected. I think there's a lot of uses here that you can see it being difficult to predict the amount of parking that would be required for something like a pet cemetery or an ultralight flight park. So just kind of going back to, there really isn't a solid rationale for the specific parking requirements that we ended up with as a city. And even at the time, the city attorney back in the 60s sort of noted at that time that it was impossible to comply with those requirements. So just a little bit more about the history. We can't find much of a rationale for this specific sort of parking formulas that we have in our code now, and this does more or less translate to what's in there currently. So it hasn't, we've added to things since 1961, but the core sort of requirements haven't really been modified. This is some information that I presented to the Chamber of Commerce recently that I just wanted to include for your benefit, but just to sort of point out that already in Oregon, we've seen some benefits from the CFEC rules for Oregon businesses, including basically reducing barriers related to parking for new businesses. So it allowed a building in Central Point, Oregon to be essentially reused because basically the situation was such that you could not build compliant parking spots and sort of keep the layout and overall sort of character of the building that was currently on site. So it allowed a developer to use the building that was on site and activate that building. Another sort of example here on the right is an arcade in Tigard who wanted to add beer, basically add a liquor license, and wasn't able to do so because that modified his parking requirements such that he couldn't really respond to that. He was in a strip mall. It wasn't, he's leasing this space, so it wasn't really within his purview to go out there and redevelop the site and think about how to add parking. And he was just one tenant of many in this sort of strip mall. So the new state parking rules ended up resolving the issue, and he was able to add that liquor license and operate his business. A few just kind of examples of how parking impacts businesses in Lake Oswego. I just wanted to point out some of the things that we hear about here at the planning department that may not be as widely known, but a lot of the multi-tenant buildings in the city have been required to do parking studies, which basically are established per the city's sort of numerical standards in the parking table. This is expensive to do. They have to do this just to kind of fill vacant commercial spaces. You build out a development. You don't exactly know what retail use is going in on the bottom floor. Once you finally find a tenant, let's say it's a restaurant, maybe the restaurant has higher sort of formula for required spaces than some of the retail uses that were envisioned when it was approved, such that it's not possible to actually meet the parking requirement and have a restaurant go into that space. So the actual tenant that is selected in these spaces can actually, has a pretty big impact on the amount of parking that's required based on the current system. So parking studies, as I mentioned, are expensive. We require an application fee of about $4,500, in addition to the thousands of dollars that it would cost to hire a traffic engineer to do the study in the first place. So just want to point out some of the businesses where we've had this issue. 3970 Mercantile Drive, particularly with the Elephant's Deli there, and at the Iron Light building as well. Some other sort of examples of where the parking standards really prevented new businesses from locating in Lake Oswego. And, I think there's different examples of this throughout the city, but the Cruise Village Shopping Center and the sort of retail structures at 16120 Boone's Ferry, we've had some issues with having to sort of deny applications for new businesses due to parking issues at those particular sites. So, there are a lot of these similar types of developments where tenant spaces can be very difficult to fill, particularly for restaurants, which are some of the things that I think folks want to see the most of in the city. But parking requirements are often an issue here, and they can preclude restaurants from locating in a lot of these existing structures. And there are some other examples here on the screen of where this is, places where we know that this has happened from our experience. So Oswego Village, Lake Place, 16140 Boone's Ferry, and then 7 to 10 Center Point. So this is not a unique issue that's isolated to a particular complex or development. This is something that we get on a fairly regular basis. All right, so that's just a quick review of kind of some of the purpose and what we've heard so far. I'll pause really quickly here to see if there are any questions about what I just went over, especially some of that new information.
This is not, I can share yours. Thank you. I guess my question is, on the previous page, how did those businesses eventually resolve their issue? Did they just pay the engineer to do the work and move
No,
on?
I mean, this is a situation where businesses could not locate in these developments. It was just a no.
So they just moved on?
Yeah, we as a city had to deny the businesses, sort of application to locate in that space. Yeah.
So the way that it generally works is that the business will come to our planning counter or give us a call and say, hey, we're thinking about locating at this location, in which case we'll tell them, okay, well, are you an allowed use? That's the first thing we look at. And the next thing we look at is, do you have enough parking? And what we find is some of these multi-tenant complexes tend to, if they have quite a few restaurants in there, that can fill up your parking, and they could have these empty tenant spaces that they just cannot fill because any other use that goes in there will put them over their parking requirement.
Okay.
Some have elected to do parking studies, but as Erik pointed out, that can be quite expensive and prohibitive. So a lot of times these businesses, they won't even get to the point where they apply for a business license. They'll just move on and say, okay, well, I can't locate there. And they have to move on and look elsewhere.
That's a good point. It doesn't actually usually get to the point of denial because we have these conversations at the planning counter.
I don't have a question, but I do want to thank you for putting this together. I appreciate it. I know I was one of the ones that asked for some of this information.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Happy to help and explain things. That's why I'm here. Any other questions before I move on? All right. All right, so this is another response to a request from, I think, at least 2 commissioners, if not more. Generally looking for a high-level overview of the pros and cons of the different options for compliance with CFEC parking. So this is just a really loose overview that we've seen before. I have my own version of this that I can talk a little bit more about, but as you can see, option 1 is very simple. Option 2 and 3 have a lot more complication to them. Basically, a variety of different approaches that we could take within options 2 and 3, but I'll try to summarize them here as best I can. So option 2 I've described as fair policies. So really, you can select from one of 5 different policies. I'm sorry, you can select from 5 policies. You have to select 2 of those 5. So the options include unbundling parking for residential, for commercial, or a flexible commute benefit for businesses with more than 50 employees, tax on parking lot revenue, or no more than half space per unit mandated for multifamily. So you pick 2 of those things, and for the purposes of our discussion, for option 2, I selected sort of a few different a few different things, but I assumed that we would pick 3 and 4 on option 2, fair policies, primarily because this is somewhat of the option that would result in the highest required parking. So if we're kind of taking the option where we want to maintain parking requirements, option 2 would probably be the best option. So because of that, I did not select the no more than half space per unit for multifamily or unbundling for that one, just because it was logical to just say, all right, if we're going with option 2, we're most likely going to try to avoid reducing parking requirements in a general sense. There's also, sort of 2 options within option 2, 2A and 2B. For 2A, I assumed, or I just, went with the sort of option A here, which is to remove parking mandates within and a quarter mile from town centers. So I should have explained, but I'm sure we remember from before that in addition to the sort of 2 of 5 options for option 2, you have to select from A and B, as you can see on the screen here, either remove parking mandates within town centers and a quarter mile from town centers, or adopt parking management in those town centers. So A is fair policies, but still has removed parking mandates within the town center, and B is parking management. So that includes paid on-street parking, roughly for about 10% of the spaces in that area that are on-street spaces, a half space per unit required for residential use, and no mandates for commercial use. So there'd still be some requirements to reduce parking requirements. We're still going to reduce parking requirements if we're going to comply with option 2B, but just less so than some of the other options. That's probably the option, though, that would get you the most required parking. In terms of option 3, there's a similar sort of A and B selection there, basically because option 3 involves eliminating parking requirements for development within and a half mile from town centers. I assume that we would go with option A because that also is removing parking mandates within and a quarter mile from town centers. So it'd be really easy to comply with that if we were doing option 3, which is already going to require us to do it at a greater radius from those town centers. So just to quickly go over option 3, it's what we're calling the reduced red tape approach, what DLCD has called that, I guess. And that would involve eliminating minimum parking requirements for a variety of different uses and situations, changes of use and different types of development. So there would be no parking for studios and 1-bedroom apartments, group quarters, sort of transit-oriented and mixed-use developments, new uses or expansions, historic districts, LEED certified or buildings built pursuant to the REACH code, buildings that have been vacant for a while, small businesses, schools, bars and taverns, and within those town centers and a half-mile radius from them. So that should overall kind of give you the lay of the land. I'm looking at 4 options here, so really 1, 2A, 2B, and 3, and that's what I'm going to go over, kind of the pros and cons of each of those. So I will just get moving here. Option 1 is the easiest to explain. This involves essentially repealing all parking mandates in the city. I just want to stress, we'd still have parking code. We would still have regulations related to parking. We'd have maximum parking standards, as well as regulations governing how large they can be and different sort of design-related standards for larger parking lots. But for the most part, there would be no minimum parking requirements under option 1. Just want to also remind folks that other cities throughout Oregon have been selecting this option. Most recently, Beaverton, as of a few months ago, selected this option. So the majority of the cities that have already complied with CFEC in Oregon have selected option 1. In terms of the pros and cons, I think from staff perspective, this has a lot of benefits. So it is very simple to explain and understand. When people come to the planning counter, it would be easy for a planner to give them an answer about the amount of parking that's required on a particular lot. There's also reduced sort of staff workload and sort of wading through and interpreting those regulations and sort of implementing them on a case-by-case basis on a development review application. There would be a reduced amount of staff workload there. It wouldn't be expensive at all to implement. It would be minimal to no additional cost. It would result in the most flexible regulations for new businesses citywide and for just all development types citywide by eliminating parking requirements. So provides a lot of flexibility for new development as well as businesses looking to relocate. It would reduce development costs just because we know that there is a relationship between parking and the cost of housing. Just in terms of what it would do to our parking regulations, it would be a consistent application that would eliminate parking requirements or minimum parking requirements evenly throughout the city and eliminate a regulatory barrier that has been identified to all construction, not just housing and businesses. We would apply this mostly to new development or changes of use, so there could be some unique circumstances where it would apply to an existing building. If they kind of wanted it to apply to them, they could maybe come back and have the new requirement, sort of be reflected in their required parking. And yeah, I think the major con here, as folks have pointed out, is that this could result in some overflow to neighborhoods in certain circumstances. So I think just want to point out here that because the mandates would not just be removed from a specific area of the city, this is kind of difficult to predict where that overflow could happen. But in general, it's something the city would have to monitor over the long term and potentially look at some parking management in those areas where overflow could be occurring. Again, we don't know that it would happen, but it is, this is the option where that would be the most likely possibility, I guess. So it's something that the city could mitigate, but it is, I'd say that's the biggest con to this approach. I'd say another sort of pro here is that the parking is very responsive to that market demand, and you're not going to end up with sort of overbuilt parking lots on a site. All right, so I did my best just to kind of run through that, but are there any questions about the pros and cons for option one here as we've outlined them, or are there any other values or ways of looking at this that you think are missing here, or do you have any comments? I'm getting a thumbs up, so I'm going to move on. All right, so just to remind you what's sort of included in options 2 and 3. For either option, you have to implement all 8 of the provisions you see on the screen. So don't want to go over all of those, but there's a lot of sort of nuanced regulations involved for both of these options. Probably the biggest thing to point out, again, this is kind of back to that A or B option. So you could either remove all parking mandates within 1/4 mile distance of climate-friendly areas in the city, or adopt parking management. So you could choose those options for either 2 or 3, but I basically assume that if we were doing the parking management, we would be going with option 2. And I think the biggest thing to kind of point out here, I think that I just want to make sure is clear, and under any of these options, there would be a pretty significant reduction of parking requirements within Lake Grove specifically. So even under option 2B, which would be the sort of option that would result in the highest parking required, there would still be no parking required for commercial developments within Lake Grove, and only 1.5 space per unit for residential. So under any circumstance, we are going to be looking at reductions to required parking in Lake Grove. I just basically tried to point this out. There really isn't any alternative, although it can be sort of either 1/2 space per unit under option 2B or removed entirely for residential. But for the most part, a lot of these are meant to apply in the town centers, and because much of the existing or the sort of downtown town center has been covered by the phase A of the CFEC work, a lot of the sort of implications are going to land in Lake Grove. That's kind of why we're isolating Lake Grove in particular. It's one of the 2 town centers that already has not effectively had parking requirements eliminated. So option 2, as I pointed out before, there's 5 different options. You have to pick 2 of those. I'm assuming that, I made a sort of a judgment, I suppose, that we would be selecting 3 and 4, which would be kind of maybe the easiest for us to implement out of these 5, probably the lowest cost, but still would require some pretty substantial differences in terms of what we do as a city. So number 3 here would be that we would require employers of 50 or more employees to provide a flexible commute benefit if they provide free or subsidized parking to their employees at the workplace. So essentially, we would institute a new requirement for employers within the city that they would have to offer some type of benefit for their employees. If they provide parking, they should be able to subsidize things like transit, like a TriMet pass or something along those lines is often used for this. So that's sort of what that looks like here. And 4 would be a tax on revenue from commercial parking lots. The city does not have any commercial parking lots, so this is kind of a bit of a cheat, but we could still select number 4 and it would be pretty low impact. So just to talk.
If I may, sorry to interrupt, just looking at subsection 445 that lays these out, I don't think I saw anywhere reference to how it now requires that we include at least one provision from A through C, so it'd be one of the first 3.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't want to make it too complicated, but that is true. We have to do at least one, the way it's numbered on here, 1 through 3, we'd have to do at least one of those. So that's why I selected number 3. There'd be the fewest sort of implementation issues, I suppose, if we did not do unbundling. But that flexible commute benefit still would be somewhat of a departure from our current policy. But that's a good point. Thank you, Commissioner Rigby. I'm trying to keep things high level, but I'm happy to dig into some details whenever that's appropriate here.
Eric, I do have one quick question on, so for something like number 3, how would a city typically enforce that?
I don't know about enforcing. I really don't have much
Like how
of
do
an
you
experience
know?
with that, but you know, I've
Just
actually
curious.
worked at a place that did a similar commute benefit for another city. It was a nonprofit. So it wasn't the city that was doing it, but it was implemented through a nonprofit. But that is something that we can look into more, but it would be sort of a new system where the city would ask, you know, employers of 50 more employees to prove in some way that they're offering this program. Evan Boone has more.
Well, we require a lot by code. It's required. Okay? And we are complaint driven. So that's how we would start.
Fair enough.
But it is kind of new territory, I guess. But it's certainly something that it happens in other cities and is not wildly out of place. So just look at the pros and cons here. You can see there's a little bit more on the con side, but still some on the pro as well. This would be more difficult to explain and understand than at least in option 1, and compared to even our existing regulations, it would add additional complexity. It would increase the staff workload. We'd be looking at sort of different regulations based not only on the zoning district, but on the specific kind of use. So it wouldn't just be based on, it would be fairly sort of minute kind of level of detail that we're not currently doing for our parking regulations. So I think that's just something, it would increase the complexity and staff workload. The flexible commute benefit could include some sort of cost for implementation. I think the that's the biggest piece here. If we are going with the reduced parking mandates option, we'd have to sort of figure out a way to monitor the flexible commute program as well. And so that would be some new regulations and sort of systems for the city. There would be some flexibility for new businesses under this approach, including particularly those in Lake Grove that are looking to locate there. There would be some reduction in parking requirements, but not a huge amount. Also flexibility for any type of development, not just businesses in Lake Grove. Again, the sort of impacts here are more specific to Lake Grove because that's where we would see the reduction in parking requirements. So it would have the potential impact of reducing the cost of development, including housing development in that area. It would reduce regulatory barriers to some degree, not eliminate them, but it would reduce them. And it would only require parking in locations that are further from transit or less walkable, so there's a bit of a rationale to that. One of the biggest issues here, though, is that the regulations really depend on use and location or proximity. So really we're looking at, you know, not just what is a zoning district, but how far away is it from a town center. Town centers are, you know, something that I don't assume is going to change anytime soon, but it's just kind of adds a whole other layer in terms of what we usually look at the planning counter And it would have different impacts in different parts of the city. So this wouldn't be that sort of even distribution that's consistently applied citywide. It would probably have more of an impact, positive and negative, within the Lake Grove area and within a half mile of that town center. I would say just one thing I want to point out here is that the flexible commute benefit program would apply to existing businesses. So that's something that, option one, we wouldn't be going to places and, employers in the city and saying, hey, you have to do this now. So that is something that would impact existing businesses that are located in, existing developments currently. So it wouldn't just apply to, or at least it wouldn't primarily apply to new development. It would also apply to existing developments. Yeah, just in terms of the other pros, there's parking reductions for sustainable infrastructure or accessible dwelling units. That's something that is baked into both options 2 and 3, but we could also include for option 1 as well. Although we couldn't really reduce parking, but we could still incentivize sustainable infrastructure or accessible dwelling units in some way. And yeah, I guess I would just point out there is also a potential for parking overflow into the neighborhood with this option, but it would be more isolated to the Lake Grove area and within a half mile of Lake Grove. So it wouldn't necessarily be a citywide application, but we would, any of those potential impacts would likely be within that specific area. I think we could look at the other sort of town center and say that there could be some parking overflow there, but that's already kind of baked into the requirements that we have. So we're not really talking about whether to implement new reductions in downtown, mostly just in Lake Grove. All right, so that kind of covers the fair parking reduced mandates. And so this is looking at, again, if we were to, instead of selecting number 1 here, but we said, let's do parking management, fair parking plus parking management. So just to go over what that means adopting a parking benefit district with paid on-street parking, as I mentioned earlier. We would be doing code amendments to require no more than a half space per unit for residential and no parking required for commercial within the town center area. So just in terms of the cons, you can see there's probably, there's a lot of cons in terms of the implementation side in particular. It'd be fairly challenging to implement. There'd be a pretty complex set of requirements that, we'd have to look at to determine what the parking requirement is on a given site. There would be new regulations and compliance monitoring for that new paid parking district. That's something that we don't have currently, that we haven't had before. So that would have some budgetary impacts and require additional staff resources. Again, that's something that's not really in our wheelhouse. It would continue a lot of the regulatory barriers that we do see for new businesses, though there would be some reduction. And we could see that flexible commute program having some impacts on existing businesses. We could always, talk to those businesses and see what how receptive they are to this program. There's not really any additional flexibility for development or reduction in development costs that we would envision from this one, particularly with that sort of paid parking component. It would have a pretty big impact on the way we implement parking regulations currently. And this was the one that would, as I mentioned before, really result in the highest possible parking requirements. So it could impact existing developments, and it's not really based on actual market demand or conditions. It's sort of a bit of an outdated system that we would be maintaining with this option. So there is a con in that, of course, there's that, it still retains that sustainability and accessibility incentive. But I guess for the most part, we had a hard time thinking of pros for this option 2B, but it kind of depends on your value system and sort of what you want us to be looking at here. So I do want to hear if there's any other sort of criteria that we should be considering. But I guess with that, are there any questions about any of the pros and cons for option 2A or 2B?
Are there any planned expansions of the bus service in the area?
No, we've only been hearing that there was reduction recently, but no expansions that we've been hearing about lately.
Okay, so even if we did a flexible commute benefit of, say, paying for a bus pass, in that area, it's mostly service workers who are working weekends, so they really wouldn't be able to take the bus anyway.
They most likely would not benefit from that. I mean, if you're talking about 50-plus employee places, it's probably not going to be service workers, but maybe to some extent. But yeah, I mean, I think, you can think of the areas of the city that have good bus coverage. Downtown is the best.
Is that defined as 50-plus per location or 50-plus for the entire business? Thinking like Zupans, for instance.
I believe it's per location, but I can follow up on that for you. I don't think the idea is that you'd, be applying this to businesses that only have like a small location here that have a lot of employees elsewhere. I think it's more about the employees in the city. But that's a good point and well taken. That the idea of a flexible commute benefit program is that you depend on transit, or at least incentivize the use of transit, and we don't have great transit, so that's maybe not the best option for folks in Lake Oswego.
Yeah, I'd be curious, like, what are the businesses then that have over 50 people that would be using that benefit, or if it would just be an empty gesture for us to enact that?
I will look into that in terms of just getting a quick scan of the businesses in the city where this would apply. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of your general observation, I think that there is an element to be where the city is kind of just trying to comply with things, but not really taking as big of a step forward as we could be in terms of reforming our parking regulations in general. But I think. So I guess the empty gesture, concept is difficult for me to specifically talk about, but I think that, like I said, this isn't something that doesn't exist elsewhere, but perhaps in the city it would be less beneficial to employees.
Maybe we can rename it the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
I think grocery stores and maybe a couple hotels might be the ones that would be potentially 50-plus. I can't really think of any other type, commercial type.
Yeah, the Southwest employment area, the areas over by the freeway that have, I'm not sure how many people work at Yakima, for instance, but there's a good number of employees out there. So, yeah, but I can try to do more than just a off the top of my head scan and get you some more information on that.
Thank you.
All right, so option 3, this is, again, a mouthful. I don't want to go over every single thing here. We've talked about this before. But essentially it applies to different uses in different locations and buildings that have received specific certifications in different ways. And it also requires the city to implement at least one pricing mechanism, either a residential parking district, parking benefit district, which is kind of what we've been talking about, or that multifamily residential units be unbundled parking. So again, this is one that involves the paid parking district. Again, this is pretty difficult to understand, increases sort of the amount of time that we would be spending on parking applications or just development review. This is probably the most complex option. It has the most sort of labyrinthine set of different uses and certifications that can lead you to different parking requirements. This would require new regulations and monitoring for the paid parking. It would add some flexibility for businesses and developments, particularly housing within town centers, Lake Grove specifically. So it has similar sort of pros and cons to option 2A, or similar pros at least. You'd only be requiring parking in locations that are a bit further from transit, and it would reduce some regulatory barriers. I think, again, this would have differing impacts in different parts of the city, and really, that paid parking could impact existing businesses more so than some of the other options here. So yeah, I don't want to go over every single thing here, but I think it's helpful to kind of look at the overarching kind of what this all looks like in terms of the pros and cons. This is at least staff's analysis. And again, happy to answer any questions about this or receive any input from the commission. Any questions on this before I move on to the schedule? All right, let's keep it moving then. So here to talk a little bit about a revised schedule and a more of a fleshed out public engagement plan for this project. I guess, moving backwards a little bit, we are coming out here right now talking a little bit more about this work plan and public engagement plan. The last meeting, both at the Planning Commission and City Council, we ended up getting more kind of background from DLCD and kind of using that more as an educational work session. So I kind of tried to modify our approach to sort of accommodate that. But I just want to point out that City Council kind of had expressed interest back on the 5th of September in, or at least a majority of members of City Council expressed interest in option 1. So that's kind of where we've been focusing a lot of our attention and energy. And so at that study session, we also received guidance from City Council, based on that sort of idea that this would be a simplified type of proposal. Is there any way that you could sort of simplify the work plan? And the answer is, we can sort of, but we're still going to have to do a ton of outreach because this is the one that's going to, need the most sort of community buy-in. So that's really what I went back and developed a schedule sort of in response to is, how can we perhaps minimize the number of work sessions at City Council and Planning Commission and add more on the engagement side. Not that there's not enough Planning Commission and City Council work sessions here too. I think there's going to be plenty. So that's kind of the idea, is that after sort of the work session today and the study session at Council next week, I would go out and our staff would go out and do outreach essentially until April, more or less. So a good 3-4 months of going out and talking to different boards and groups in the neighborhood, kind of meeting them where they typically meet, going out and doing that outreach and seeing how they feel about this. So that is generally the idea. Still kind of planning to come back in April instead of having individual work session at the Planning Commission and study session at City Council. The idea is also to have a joint meeting with the City Council in April so that can sort of report back what we heard from the community, kind of give you a synopsis of the outreach, and this will also include a community meeting in March, early March, that we're planning to do, and that we would have a meeting sort of in April with you all in the council to get some direction on what to draft up for the code amendments. So get some loose direction on an option, more or less at that point, and kind of the particulars of that option. And then work a little bit more with the Planning Commission to draft the code itself and make sure we're writing it up in the best and most efficient way, I guess. And we would ultimately be moving this to a hearing in fall of next year, so towards the end of the year. So that's the schedule. Kind of just a
quick question for you. When you do your community research, do you videotape any of the people that, if they're comfortable with that, to bring back and show video testimony one way or another to
No, we typically don't do that. And I think that's one thing, when we do this outreach, it's difficult to sort of synthesize and summarize all the information we're hearing from folks. So a lot of times, when we spoke with, for instance, like the Sustainability Network, they indicated that they might be coming up with like a statement as like a group that they would put together, kind of a positional statement on things. So, I think different committees or boards prefer to handle it a bit differently, and it kind of depends on their reaction a bit. But I think, I don't know if I can go into like, say I want to start videotaping this meeting, even though you don't usually do that, but I can certainly do my best to capture what is said and present that as sort of directly as possible to you all when we come back in April.
Yeah, to me, it's just always so powerful to hear it from someone that's actually living through the situation, and you just walk away with a different perspective than just reading text.
Absolutely, yeah. And
I understand they might not want to be videotaped.
Well, we can still try to get that type of input if that's the type of input you think would be best.
Yeah.
So and I will point out we do have that community meeting open house, and we always videotape those. But yeah, so we'll videotape as much as we as a city can sort of step in and say we're videotaping this. But otherwise, I might have to get a bit more creative. But the idea is to have some kind of at least minutes or some type of direct output. If we can get video, I will try.
Yeah. Okay. Happy to help you do that.
Well, yeah, it's not really about me. It's more about meeting these different boards and networks on their own terms. Some of that is fairly informal, so it's about comfort levels, I guess, a little bit too. But I will play it by ear and do my best to videotape when I can, when people are comfortable with it. So, but yeah, just to explain a little bit more about kind of the outreach I was talking about. the idea would be to come out and do more kind of targeted discussions about the parking reform ideas to various different groups in the city, including the Chamber of Commerce, Lake Grove Business Committee, which actually made at least one presentation already to the chamber, but I will most likely be going back. So I've already started this outreach, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Also, the idea would be to go to the Sustainability Network, which I've already discussed with them a little bit as well, but go back and talk with them some more. The Mayor's Roundtable, Neighborhood Chairs Committee, and the Transportation Advisory Board are the other big bodies that we wanted to make sure that we were presenting this at. The other idea that we had was to do a focus group with other stakeholders from the community that we don't necessarily want to exhaust the capacity of all these boards and different commissions and networks, but to see if we can find representatives from, for instance, the Housing Production Strategy Task Force, Sustainability Advisory Board, the DEI Advisory Board, all those different groups to try to have a more sort of focused discussion. And that's another thing that we can absolutely record and get more direct sort of input for you to take a look at. This would be in addition to maintaining the project website, providing updates on the project website, updates in the Hello LO publication put out by the city. We'd have an email list where we would provide project updates. Again, the open house community meeting, as well as meetings here at the Planning Commission and City Council as usual. So that's kind of the idea, trying to sort of reach out to folks and connect with folks that might not show up and just come out to a Planning Commission meeting and testify on things, trying to sort of, again, meet them where they are and have a pretty robust kind of spread of the different types of groups we're touching base with here. So I, would be open to any input that the commission might have on additional, groups or additional sort of folks to reach out to for this work or any other ideas that you have on the public engagement. I'm really, I guess, looking for some type of sign off on a public engagement plan. So if you have direction, that's great. If you don't, it would be good to at least know that you're comfortable with this.
I have a question. So for the initial targeted outreach, are you more or less presenting something similar to what you did tonight, where you're talking about 3 or 4 different options, or are you sort of focusing on a certain one?
I think we would certainly explain the options, but we wouldn't just focus on option 1 necessarily, but there would be more background and probably, opportunities to get more general input on things that we should value, particularly, should we be concerned about the way this is impacting businesses, or should we be more concerned about the overflow piece, et cetera. We will be discussing the options, but in terms of like the level of research that staff is going to put into like, doing something like unbundling, I think that's, we're not going to go out and overload people with talk of unbundling parking requirements, if that makes sense.
And I guess the other comment I would have is in the absence, like say you're not able to do some sort of interactive recording like a videotape or something like that, I think the idea of having, or strongly encouraging each of these groups to provide like some sort of written summary or written position following your outreach session, I think would be valuable to have, for us to kind of be able to look at sort of the different takes. Yeah,
I think I can do that on like a case-by-case basis sort of thing and reach out to, when I reach out to the Neighborhood Chairs Committee, say, do you usually do meeting minutes, or would you prefer, to record this meeting? What's the best way that you would prefer to sort of translate the discussion that we're having out to the general public so the Planning Commission, City Council, other folks can kind of benefit? So I can just see what they're most comfortable with.
I think it's, obviously it's really important to kind of know how everybody feels about this.
Right, yeah. Agreed. That's kind of what we're trying to accomplish here, and I think to the extent that we can, get video recordings or some type of written statements, it's going to be extremely helpful. And I will do what I can to get that. I'm not sure we can get all of these different groups to commit to making a statement or a written statement, but I think they'll probably be okay with at least recording the meeting or something like that. So.
I have a quick question. So what happens after all of these meetings and joint workshops and all of this stuff? I mean, I'm seeing meetings into like November of next year. At what point is a decision made and who makes it?
So the idea would be for the council and the planning commission to come to some type of consensus on an option in April at that joint meeting. Then we would go out and draft the code and actually do the work that's required to actually get this into an approvable state. So the reason that meeting, the meetings would be going on October, November of next year is really just because we have noticing requirements. We have to have some time internally once we know what the option will be to actually draft that code, make sure it's going to work and not present sort of headaches for the next 5 years or so, as can happen with some code amendments. So we want to make sure that those are thought out. And also DLCD has some fairly early noticing requirements. So we want to make sure to get everything in line so that we can actually send it out 35 days in advance of the planning commission hearing. So anyway, it's really to build in enough time to do the drafting and make things tight, if you will, in terms of the way we're drafting the code and to meet the noticing requirements. So we're hoping just to have one meeting really to talk through the specific code before the hearing, if that works. All right, so I don't want to close the book on this conversation exactly, but if you have any other direction for us in terms of where we should focus our efforts, anything, if you're really interested in, for instance, that flexible commute benefit, I got some direction to look into the businesses that would apply to tonight and get a little bit more on that. But if there's anything else in terms of, aspects we should focus on or areas to sort of spend our energy. Commissioner Twing, did you have a comment? I can't tell.
What would probably be helpful to me is some examples of how this would operate in a particular parking setting. It's one thing to just deal with a situation and say, you have these options, but how would it actually work with regard to some existing situations that you see developing here in the city? And, it seems to me that you probably have a variety of those kind of examples right there in Mercado Village or Mercado, whatever it is. But, but anyway, there are a variety of different parking situations there. You've given us one example tonight of the delicatessen there that I just really don't know how that would, how those things would really vary anything.
Sure.
Whether it's option 1, 2, or 3.
I can go over like a specific example that would talk about, how that would all work when we apply the requirements, just to kind of make it a little bit more illustrative. That might even be a good way to take this out and discuss it publicly, to talk about, okay, this is the difference in how these options would actually be implemented, and let's look at a real project and what that might look like.
Well, with somebody like me, that would work.
It's great input. Always looking for ways to make this a little bit more digestible. So, anything else on the public engagement plan or the options or anything moving forward? Folks comfortable with that sort of setup where we're going out and doing outreach for a few months, coming back, meeting with the council in a joint session and discussing this? Is that clear?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I like the leaning that you have, but I mean, ultimately, it's going to be, it's going to be decided by what you hear from the public.
Yeah, and I think we might hear different things from different members of the public too.
I have no doubt, but But yeah, we need to, I mean, it's hard, it's hard for, I mean, me personally right now, just to comment on it without, having sort of back, right? But I think just in terms of sort of the direction that you've taken to flesh out the information, I think is the right approach.
I think the public is going to have opinions on this, this looks like, a fine plan for presentation, the way, we've received these pros and cons, I think, they're going to come to that. Just for me, when we're talking about the flexibility for businesses, it's one thing for, parking requirements, imposing a restriction on being able to have a business come in or not, but also having adequate parking or the lack thereof is a factor in, whether businesses are going to be successful. So I think that also ties into, the business element. It's not only a matter of, business is helped by, reducing parking requirements. It's also helped by, having parking so that their patrons can come there. Like, for example, you brought up Mercado Grove. I know a lot of people who, won't go to Mercado Grove because they can't get parked there. So I think if, that's an element that's being presented to the public, then I think that is an important element of that priority.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is getting some type of quantifiable way to show that. I mean, we don't hear that as much. I think we might have some examples, but it's kind of, difficult to quantify generally.
Well, I think the problem with our current parking regulations is we don't know how successful a business is going to be. So you could have a restaurant go into a strip mall that doesn't have a lot of parking requirements and they'll do just fine, and then a Starbucks goes in there and all of a sudden there's not enough parking for anyone. So that's the downside of having these sort of one-size-fits-all parking requirements for all types of restaurants. You have one requirement. So but it's a point well taken. If a complex or business is very successful, they may, but some of them build their model on that. Look at Trader Joe's, right? They never have enough parking at any location that's ever been, and believe me, people find a way to get there. So, so I think it just depends. But your point is well taken. I mean, obviously, any business looking to locate in a location will want to make sure that they've got enough parking so that they can have customers.
That is a very good example, that the Starbucks example there, because I can't remember the name of the street. It's where the Lake Grove Elementary School is, but when that went in,
Yes.
that created a gigantic traffic problem there, not only just for the people driving up and down that street, but across the street, people were parking in their parking lot, and they had to put up signs to restrain people from doing that, and they continually have a problem like that. But that is a really excellent example of
That is what I had in mind. That's the poster child, right? It used to be a KFC, and
Yeah.
then it got changed to a Starbucks, and is much more successful than the KFC was.
Yeah, way more, and constant too. It's not something that's going away.
Right, but same parking requirement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you might imagine how difficult it would be to predict that they would be so different for Starbucks than for KFC, and that having like a standard formula for both of them would kind of not make sense, given that we saw a very different outcome for both of them. And I guess another thing, just for flexibility for businesses, I know some existing businesses might be concerned about having enough parking or maintaining enough parking, but I guess the sort of flip side to that is not having a business go in the first place and having that be an outcome, and sort of having a lot of vacant commercial space throughout the city and that being another outcome to consider. So regardless, if we can find some way to quantify that, I'm happy to throw that in, or just at least include that in terms of the pros and cons of what could be an impact on businesses.
I have a question about option 1. Are there any sort of like guardrails or guidelines for developers to show that they have backed up their decision about what kind of parking to include? If we just leave it in the developer's hands. They can just kind of do whatever they want, even if, we're saying, oh, the market would decide, but developers aren't planners, and they don't often think long range, and they don't often think communally. Some do, some don't, but is there any thought to that?
No, and that wouldn't be the case for almost any of these options. So in all the places where we're reducing parking requirements, the idea is to minimize the costs. And if you're going to go out and do this big traffic study and try to prove exactly how many parking spaces that you'll generate, that is that cost that we're hoping to avoid. So that is a piece of this, is that the developer is not going to get this right on the first time that they go out and sort of try to figure out how much parking they need. It'll be a learning process for sure. But obviously this is something that a lot of other cities have done, and a lot of those sort of the outcomes there show that it is not necessarily resulting in that type of acute overflow that you might expect from those situations. In some situations they do, but in a suburban location like Lake Oswego, that's certainly nothing that we have seen a precedent for, if that makes sense. We've seen the positive impacts, I guess, not so much the negative ones so far. At least in Oregon through CFEC. Yeah.
The examples you showed were all cities that opted for option one?
Yeah. So there's, I think, 8 cities currently that have already sort of adopted something, because the original deadline was July of this year. So we got an extension, but the cities that did not get a deadline primarily chose option one. So yeah, Portland and Salem, Corvallis, Bend, a bit bigger cities, but also ones that are a little bit more similar to Lake Oswego, like Tigard, Albany, Central Point, smaller cities at least that might be a little bit more akin to the atmosphere or the conditions in Lake Oswego. I think there's one community, I want to say it's Medford, could be wrong about that, but I think there's at least one community that's looking at option 3, but they haven't adopted it yet.
Have you been in communication with any of them to talk to them about?
I have not been in communication with the staff in these cities. I think we've talked with Tigard about other things, but generally, this is information that we got from DLCD and other sources. But
this is new though, so these folks have only had this implementing for like
in July.
4 months. So
yeah,
right.
Can't know what the effects are.
Well, I mean, we know what the effects of eliminating parking requirements have been in other cities that have done it, I guess, is more. And there are cities in Oregon that did this before it was required. But that's not to say that the impacts are going to be exactly the same in every city, and that, we know exactly what will happen here in our city because of what's happening in Tigard, for instance. So, but more information obviously is never bad. So that's something that if that's something that would be helpful, I can definitely try to reach out to staff at these different cities and see if I can get high-level input from them in some fashion.
Eric, if we went with the option one, and it was, well, actually it could be applicable to all 3 options, but I'm trying to figure out the repeal of the parking mandates, or a reduction of them in the other options, the applicability to things that are already developed, right? Mm-hmm. And trying to figure out are we deciding what's going to apply only to new developments going forward, commercial and or residential, or could a commercial area that built under an existing mandate that's now been repealed, in theory, say, I don't need half these parking spots, now I can, partition the lot and sell it and build it? Like, what is the effect we have really at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think that would be something that we could provide as an option, within option 1, if we were to go with the full repeal. It is the case. So first of all, there are developments that have come in for various development review permits and things of that nature over the course of the past, decades, that have cemented with their development review permit a certain number of parking spaces required for that development. So they could theoretically come back to the city and say, hey, we would like to have the new parking requirements applied to our site. The question is whether or not we would do that through an application process, or we would somehow build that into the code to allow that on a more ministerial level. But it is something that we could choose to apply to. I mean, we would have to apply to all development, and so it would just be a question of how much we facilitate that, I guess, if that makes sense. So are we going to require some people to come into the, do a pre-app and talk about going through the whole process to get their parking requirement reduced, or would it be more straightforward?
Well, what I would say is, like taking, for instance, the Cruise Village Shopping Center off of Cruise Way and Meadows as an example. So when they had their development review permit, they made an assumption on the types of uses that they would have there, and they were required to provide a certain number of parking spaces. So that was baked into the development review application. Now that they've been there and operating for a while, of course, tenants change over time. So if we repealed the parking requirements, they couldn't reduce the number of parking spaces they had, so they couldn't like redevelop their parking lot because that would run afoul of their development review permit. They would have to come in for some sort of modification in order to do that, but it would free up their ability to lease out their tenant spaces. So right now, because they're bound to the numerical standards, they can only have so many restaurants before they run out of spaces, and then they have to leave all the rest of their tenant spaces empty. That would go away. They could fill up all their tenant spaces, but they just couldn't reduce the number of parking spaces that they were required to have on the site, if that makes
Unless
sense.
they like resubmitted for.
That's right,
Okay.
a modification.
I guess when we're seeing the stats of, and I don't know actually if we had a figure for Lake Oswego, but 45% of all parking in such and such city is unused and 35% here, are we gonna, if we have a percentage in Lake Oswego, 25% of parking is unused and already developed land, like, it'd be nice to tap into that to provide housing or to provide whatever we need to provide. That's sort of part of the point here too. So I guess that was my line of thinking in terms of retroactive application of the repeal of mandates.
Yeah, I think, that's the way that it would apply currently. It would require a DR mod, but there is, we could always kind of build something into the code that would allow the parking reduction to sort of be processed on a different type of system. I guess that's something that Deputy City Attorney Boone and I discussed briefly. But yeah, so it's kind of a question how we would handle that, but for the most part, that's the idea. And even under options 2 and 3, I think you're required to allow for the redevelopment of existing parking lots as well. So there's other specific provisions that allow for that for options 2 and 3. And then we could further facilitate it with option 1.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm sure there's more questions. I'm happy to address those now. You can always email me offline, just give me a call. I'm happy to talk this through whenever. But are there any more questions that you want to address now? Because if not, I will conclude my presentation.
And you're presenting this to council next?
Next
like
Tuesday.
A week, next
Yep.
week, basically the same information.
That's the idea. I need to get their sign off on the public engagement plan too. So.
Right, so I guess if there's no further questions, please feel free to email or call Eric if anything arises. With that, we'll close the work session for this evening and move on to other business, which...
All right, so there is a piece of business that I just wanted to make you all aware of, and it relates to the commission's goal setting and the summit sort of process for this year. And there will be kind of a revamped version of the goal setting summit with City Council this year. For the most part, the implication is that most of the planning for goals this year will be done at the summit. It'll be more of like an interactive workshop. And essentially allow council and the different boards and commissions to align their goals. But there's less of sort of an initial goal setting work required of the commission. There's still a bit, but for the most part, it's going to be more at the beginning of next year. And the idea is to coordinate it more directly with the city council goals. So this is all to say, we don't have a goal setting agenda item before the end of the year. But I'm going to draft up something with the top sort of, I've been asked to put together 3 accomplishments for last year and 3 themes or goals for next year to focus on. So I just, want to draft that up and send it out and get your input on it, basically. We have a deadline of the 15th, December 15th, so something that we'll probably want to handle primarily via email, but we don't have to. We can always discuss it in person. But for the most part, it's just kind of the beginning of the goal-setting exercise, and then that more full, fleshed-out conversation is intended to take place at the goal-setting summit with council. Questions about that?
Real quick, has a date been set for that summit yet?
No, we don't have specific information on the summit as of yet. This is hot off the presses that we're looking for a snapshot of the different sort of themes for next year as of the, by December 15th. But
I was
this
trying
is
to remember,
brand
is
new.
it usually it's usually in January or February?
It's in mid-January usually, yeah. And it's usually like on a Thursday or something, I want to say. It's not a normal meeting date. So there might be a date already, but okay, yeah, we will follow up with you when we have one, if we do have one. And if we don't, we'll let you know that as well. But yeah, essentially, we will still need to come up with just a quick snapshot of what we did this year, as well as what our big goals are for next year by the 15th. And unfortunately, we kind of have those mandated by the state for the most part. We got housing, we got parking, and there's some room for discussion on that third one. So my idea is that I'll send out just like some ideas and have you add to those, or chime in if you disagree or want to take a different direction, I suppose. But unfortunately, we do have kind of mandated ones that are going to dominate a lot of the next year. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective.
I guess we can then slide into schedule review.
Yes, speaking of the Planning Commission schedule, our next work session will be the second one on the annual code amendments that Ellen Davis will be here leading that session on the 11th of December. I won't be here on that day. Director Namanalu will be here with Ellen on that date. The next work session after that will be on the 8th of January of 2024. That will be another sort of follow-up on the housing production strategies. So that will be our, I think, 5th work session on the housing production strategies. And then, yeah, the sort of 22nd of January, we'll have your first joint meeting of 2024. It will be a joint meeting with the Development Review Commission to talk about the Urban and Community Forestry Plan, which is something that Director Numanalu has been working on for almost a year now. But there's a lot more sort of progress to be done in the next year or so on that. So they're going to come, we're going to meet with the DRC and talk about that project. So some exciting opportunities to get to know other boards and commissions.
That'll be on our date or their date? That's
So
ours,
that will
right?
be on our date, the 22nd, yeah. That's the idea. I think the joint city council planning commission one would be on a council date, so I'll confirm that with them though.
All right, any questions on schedule? If not, we're adjourned.
The Boards and Commissions Summit is on Thursday, January 11th. It is. And it's from 6 to 7:30, and it'll be at the Adult Community Center. And we'll send out a meeting invitation. They probably haven't, she probably hasn't sent out the formal invitation yet, but we'll send that out soon as a save the date.
Oh, I did have one more question. Is it too late? Oh, off the record. You had attended the roundtable, I think,
Last week,
on housing. Anything good come out of that or of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think Commissioner Najak was there. Were any of the rest of you there? I know that some folks had maybe indicated they were going to come, but I at least saw Commissioner Najak. It was a lively conversation. It was pretty conversational. I tried to talk a little bit about the housing needs analysis, and like the first stat I threw out, it just kind of went a different direction. Yeah, I had all sorts of things I had planned to say, but it kind of just became a free-flowing conversation. Yeah, and I think we got good input. We heard concerns from folks that were, had concerns about growth. We also heard from folks that really wanted to make sure that we were growing the right way and that we were constructing the type of housing they wanted to see, not just large, sort of single-family